Hello and welcome to Ukrainian Flames, a special project by Ukraine Crisis Media Center, NGO Euro-Atlantic Course and Analytical Center of Ukrainian Catholic University. My name is Victoria Zabian. I am head of the UCMC Press Center. Please like, share this video and subscribe our channel to stay tuned. During more than 50 days of the war that Russia conducts on Ukrainian land, for some people it is really difficult to understand whether Russian people agree with what is going on and whether they really support Putin's aggression policy. Probably for Putin it doesn't really matter to get real support from Russians, but we decided to dedicate this video to the topic, what is the Russian support of war based on? And we start with Petro Burkovsky, who explains different aspects of Russian people's support of war in Ukraine and where's the middle way between sociological figures and reality in Russia.
Let's talk about the different dimension of the Russian invasion to Ukraine. So, when we speak or argue about Russian public support of invasion to Ukraine, we must answer several key questions. First, how do we know that Russian society supports invasion in Ukraine? At first glance, we may refer to public opinion polls conducted by the state-controlled and independent pollsters like All Russian Center for Public Opinion, with Russian acronym CIOM, or Levada Center. They showed right now that pretty high numbers, at least 7 of 10 Russians, say that they endorse Putin's order about so-called special operation in Ukraine. But what is inside these figures? We do know that several years before full-scale invasion to Ukraine and after occupation of Crimea in 2014, around 40% of Russian citizens thought that Joseph Stalin, a Soviet dictator, had been a great leader and a statesman. And Levada Center showed that this admiration with Stalin grew substantially after Putin's aggression against Ukraine in 2014. Moreover, Levada Center poll in June 2021 showed that this number increased to incredible 60%. It means that people who thought about Stalin with respect, admiration, and sympathy were mentally prepared to back policies which resemble Stalin's action. So when Kremlin is appealing to a fight against Nazis or nationalists in Ukraine, it resonates with the Russian collective historical memory, carefully constructed in the last 20 years by Putin and his government. Of course, this historical memory is based in falsification of facts and silencing everybody who speak loud about terrible Stalin's crimes. It's allowed and welcomed only to speak about a great achievements like industrialization and a great victory in what is called Great Patriotic War, which is in fact a part of the Second World War from 1941 to 1945. It is not allowed to speak about Stalin's secret deal with Hitler in 1939 unless it is framed as a cunning move of Stalin to outwit Hitler and prepare Russia for the war with Hitler's Germany. The truth about Stalin's aggression against Baltic countries and Finland in 1940 is not tolerated. As a result, we have a society which is prepared to hear and believe in what government is saying about war in Ukraine and completely support justification for this war as far as it is framed as continuation of the Soviet Stalinist policy. The second important question is that whether Russian public support of war against Ukraine is a short-term or long-term phenomenon. And is it as consolidated, as strong as it seems to outsiders? In my opinion, this is a question about the level of conformity and dissent in the Russian society. The last big declaration and demonstration of dissent happened in Russia after presidential elections in 2011. Bolotnaya Square protests, which were called after location in Moscow, were crushed in all the Russia. Protest leaders were either killed, like Boris Nemtsov, or jailed, like Navalny, or forced to leave the country. Thus, now there is no organizational foundation for dissent in Russia. Secondly, by amending constitution, Putin destroyed the last legal hopes that could have been theoretically used to make democratic transition of power in their country sometimes in the future. And he re-established domestic army called Rosgvardia to suppress and crush any protest moves called for any possible reasons. So right now it's really dangerous to contest Russian government for the Russian people. The war against Ukraine has opened opportunities for the Russian regime to call every dissent as an example of Western conspiracy aimed at Russian security and unity, and encourage common Russian people to report and prosecute dissidents among their friends, colleagues, and even among relatives. This is, of course, a terrible picture, but all the facts are there, and it is hard to deny this reality in Russia. So, even if the current war hysteria in Russia and public applauses to Putin is partly corrupted by regime, partly artificial or not sincere, partly forced by fear of repression, I think that situation will not change a lot in the nearest
researcher. Russian propaganda explains public moods on the war a lot, but it doesn't mean that Russians have no alternative sources of information, and it can be an excuse for what Russian army does in Ukraine.
Frankly speaking, when I read and watch Russian TV or YouTube channels with Russian propagandists, in several minutes I started to believe that I am Nazi and it's necessary to denazify me. So I understand what does it mean to live in this crazy Goebbels-type propaganda. However, compared with the Soviet Union, it's necessary to mention that the access of information, and I lived in the Soviet Union, but at that time there was no access to alternative information with some reservations regarding Western broadcasting, which was very difficult even to listen. Now there is an internet, and it's possible to get alternative views. It's possible to get the stories. It's possible to see videos and photos of what had been done to civilians in Ukraine. Again, you may not believe the Western TV channels. Go to Al Jazeera, go to Indian TV channels, which are reflecting, by the way, to a great extent, Russian point of view, but they show these videos. It's documented by the correspondents on the ground. So there is possibility for Russian people to go after this information and to receive alternative point of view, and then just to think about what's going on. However, even many of our relatives who are in Russia, they believe this Russian propaganda. So Russian society is ill. Putin's propaganda is responsible, definitely. Russian military, Russian so-called liberation army is responsible for killings of civilians, but Russian society is also responsible, and if it would like to recover, it's necessary to be recognized.
We also have got a comment from the sociologist Anna Osipchuk. Let's take a look.
Even if the polls are not quite true, with its 83% of people supporting, with the data that shows 83% of people supporting Putin's politics and essentially the war in Ukraine, it's still from the lack of the protest and dissent in Russian society, we may assume that a huge part of Russians support the politics and support the war. And we also can see that from the online, from the discourses online, from social media, and from interviews on the streets and so on. So the question is why the support is so huge, so big. To my mind, there are several reasons, and the first one is this dominant narrative that is embedded and probably voiced by almost everyone in Russia, even within the oppositions, even by those who oppose the action, that everyone is just a little person, just one voice who can't really influence anything, who don't have much influence into politics, don't have much influence into the government, and certainly can't do anything and can't change anything. That might ring true for a year or two for latest years, but what is more important that this narrative was actually present 8 years ago in 2014. We already had this narrative in Russian society, and even before that, for example, during Orange Revolution in Ukraine, there was already this narrative there, and even 20 years ago, we also had this narrative present in Russia of one little person, one voice not really meaning anything, so that one person can't change much, so why even try? Which actually, and the government and the elites are certainly actually tried to feed into this narrative and very much. But on the other hand, this narrative is also supported by the lack of solidarity and the lack of trust, especially interpersonal trust in Russian society. And we see that for years on the data, for example, even that World Value Survey's data from a decade ago when Russia was taking part in that, which shows a lack of a very low interpersonal trust in Russian society. So there is no experience, a real experience of solidarity, of big protest that actually achieved the goals. So there is this thing on one hand. On the other hand, there is a feeling of resentment, and the resentment for a great country, for a huge geopolitical power, for one of the centers of geopolitical powers. And this resentment, which could be explained by or put into the phrase that the fall of the USSR was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe, this rather famous quote. So this resentment is not just fed by nostalgia for stability and security. It's also is fed by this imperialistic feeling and this thirst for the great country, the country that we Russians lost.
Andriy Kokotyukha, Ukrainian fiction writer, says whatever the sociological features on support of war in Ukraine by Russian society are, the fact is that Russian people silently watch how Russian army does atrocities in Ukraine, and they are not trying to stop it. Let's listen to him in the following video.
Військові злочини проти України Росія в різних формах, в різних варіаціях здійснює, повторюся, вже більше як 100 років. Сьогодні, я сподіваюся, ми бачимо фінал, ми бачимо агонію, ми бачимо смертельну агонію ворога, який, відчуваючи свій кінець, як всяка смертельно поранена тварина, стає ще більш небезпечною. Злочини, яким немає аналогів, яким немає виправдання, скоєні російською окупаційною армією в Бучі, були скоєні 8 років тому на українському Донбасі, на українському окупованому Донбасі. Там і всі ці 8 років, і дотепер в Донецьку існує концтабір ізоляція, де скоюються злочини проти людства, де російська армія та її найманці, так звані ЛДНР, і викрадають, катують людей, гвалтують людей. Повторюся, це тривало 8 років, і цивілізований світ чомусь дотепер не звертав на це увагу. Ми на передовій між європейською, західною цивілізацією, між демократичним світом і варварською територією, яку населяє 140 мільйонів нелюдів. Чому нелюді? Тому що я, як людина, знову ж таки, яка цікавиться історією, яка пише книжки, яка пише сценарії, яка аналізує, а не лише фіксує ці події, я розумію, що немає сьогодні в Росії тих, хто не винен в тому, що відбувається. Є активні виконавці, а є тих, хто мовчки підтримує агресивну політику Путіна. Є ті, хто мовчки підтримує насильство на українських землях. Є ті, хто мовчки підтримує зґвалтування наших жінок і дітей. Ось з ким сьогодні Україна веде цю нашу праведну війну.
You've been watching To Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Crisis Media Center, NGO Euro-Atlantic Course and Analytical Center of Ukrainian Catholic University. In the description to this video, you can find the information about how personally you can help Ukraine against Russian aggression. Everything is gonna be Ukraine.